Hello, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the Liszt pieces that I've edited for Peter's edition, which are useful in anybody's repertoire and also useful in competitions, and which I hope manifest a bit more accurate a version of the score than some of the editions which have been circulating up until now. The first book that I'm going to talk about is the Consolations, or Consolations, Tröstungen, of which there are 6, which have been published in one volume with the Drei Liebesträume. So let's first talk about the Consolations. These are pieces that, of course, amateur pianists love to play because more or less they lie within the ability of somebody with modest technical gifts. But don't ever be confused into thinking that that makes them easy, because they are anything but. The first, the second, the fourth and the fifth are all relatively straightforward, and all you need to do is do exactly what he says, which is to say, observe all of his articulation and all of his dynamics. When Liszt writes Dolce, as we all know, there is an implication of piano as well, which he almost never gives you in addition. So when the first Consolation starts Dolce, that's it. You have to play quietly. This phenomenon at the beginning of quite long chords, but with staccato dots, but gathered within a phrase mark, is something that is very well worth learning to do beautifully, because it applies not just in Liszt, it applies in Beethoven, it applies in Brahms's horn trio, all sorts of places where you half pedal, and then after that real legato. And if you manage to do that, then you will balance the piece very nicely, and it's a very simple tune, and it's a lovely piece altogether. He probably intended it to join straight on to the second piece, because the last bar has only got 3 beats in it, and whereas the first bar's got 4, so it's not because there's an anacrusis. There's actually a short bar, because the first bar of the next piece only has 1 beat in it. So it probably should go at the end. Which is one of Liszt's nicest melodies. So it's just as well, if you learn the first one, to learn the second one. Unusually for a collection of this nature, Liszt puts pieces consecutively in the same key. And in this book, the first and the second are in E major, and the fifth and the sixth are in E minor, E major, and the 2 in the middle are in D flat. The number 3, which is independently one of Liszt's best loved compositions, was a late substitute for an earlier piece which goes... which you will probably recognize as material which later became Hungarian Rhapsody number 1. I think he probably thought quite soon that this piece, which he called Magyar, rather stood out from the rest and wasn't quite in the right spirit. The fourth piece was always semi-religious in its look and in its nature. It is nicknamed Sternkonstellation because Liszt arranged to have a star printed at the top of the music. Unfortunately, he then did not go on and explain to anybody precisely what he meant by it. We could possibly assume it's the Star of Bethlehem. This piece has the curious dynamic marking of quasi adagio, which means don't play it too slowly. It's then marked cantabile con devozione, which is one of the few times he used that word, and that gives it its religious implication before you go any further. The melody of this piece is allegedly by the Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, and it has a connection with I don't think it's as close as some of the commentators have suggested, but nonetheless, recent articles about the sonata refer to this as the Maria Pavlovna theme. I don't think it does any violence to Liszt's conception. The fifth piece exists in several versions, as do most of these pieces, prior to the one that we all know and love. And in one of its slightly different earlier incarnations, it's called Madrigal. Quite why is not explained, but it's a very straightforward little song. The sixth piece is a bit like the last piece in the Harmonie Poétique et Religieuse, Cantique d'Amour, in that it seems somehow to be much more secular than the rest of the music. And it's also of quite a different order of technical difficulty, with a lot of getting around the piano. But otherwise it's a straightforward love song, and Liszt wrote many love songs in E major, just as Cantique d'Amour previously mentioned. And it just means that you have to steel yourself to the task and have a go at it. It doesn't have to be played too quickly. At the end of this piece is a remarkable little passage which doesn't seem to have anything to do with anything, except that it makes a more serious and devout end to the collection. So you end with a tune, finishing as it has done on each of its appearances. This little tune is all that he has preserved of the second theme from a very long piece called Dernière Illusion, which is part of an earlier set of Harmonie Poétique et Religieuse that he was writing in 1845-6, we think. And the rest of that piece became the principal material of the first ballade. So this is a little bit of a reflection on a piece that he'd already written, but he just took out the best piece of it, which is this little reflective melody, and it's a very nice way to end the whole book, because it joins the sentiment to the sentiment of the earlier pieces. Now I've left until last number 3, because number 3 is the one that everybody wants to play, and it's the one that presents on the face of it a number of difficulties, mostly to do with the pedal. In his last years, Liszt wrote, to anyone who'd listen actually, that he'd finally taken delivery of a piano with a middle pedal, which, as we all know, will sustain one note allow you to change the harmony above it. At the time when he wrote the third Consolation, he could not quite do that. He did have one piano which had a split sustaining pedal, which would only sustain the notes from this C to the bottom of the instrument. Whether he used it, we do not know any more than we know whether Beethoven used it on the piano that he had, that had a similar device. But what we do know is that in his classes, when people presented this piece, Liszt advised that all of the tied notes in the bass, where there's a repeated note, but there's a new pedal mark, you are meant to get your hand back down onto the note and strike it as quietly as possible. This allows you to change the pedal without smudging the harmonies. And of course, you can't really use the middle pedal very easily in this piece anyway, even if you wanted to, because firstly, it doesn't make the right sound, and secondly, it's marked 3 Ps at the beginning, so it's quite clear that you're going to be using the una corda pedal quite a lot, and it's very hard, unless you've got a very large foot, to get the una corda down and then with the right-hand side of your left foot operate the middle pedal. So please give up on that before you even attempt it. But instead, play pianissimo as directed. And Liszt's own pedal directions tell you exactly when you can change the pedal and or when you need to put your finger on a note in order to keep it sounding and allow the harmony to change without smudging it. I think it's very important not to mess the harmony up in this piece. It's far too beautiful. The only other textual thing of interest is that we know that when Liszt played this piece to his friends and his students, in the little cadenza a few bars from the end, he used to play the last group of notes, which is printed 4 times, but he's well reported as playing it 8 times. So this pedal direction you must observe, and it's very difficult, but worth a try. He knew perfectly well that harmony would smudge. There have been many suggestions by all sorts of people, including some of his students, who should have known better, including Emil von Sauer, who added some extra notes at the end with a harmony which is so bizarre, it sounds like it was invented by Art Tatum. You just can't do it, and you can't change pedal on all of these, and you certainly can't do that in the left hand, which is what you find in quite a number of 19th century editions. Just be brave is all I can suggest to you. Well, that's probably enough of an introduction to the Consolation. The 3 Liebesträume, it's probably too late to tell people not to call the third one Liebesträume number 3, which is not the title Liszt gave it. Liszt gave the generic title Liebesträume to the whole lot because they're all a plural of dreams, and then subtitled them 3 Nocturnes for the piano, Drei Nocturnos, and left it at that and printed the texts above each piece just to remind you that in fact their original incarnation was as songs, and that should be the absolute best clue for how you should manufacture a sound. So it's really quite straightforward. When he writes Andante espressivo assai, then he writes Il canto accentuato assai, He writes dolcissimo, una coda, l'accompagnamento sempre pianissimo e con la parte, which means you play the accompaniment just as if you're accompanying a singer, which implies therefore that your singing part can be slightly free. And we see there that he actually prints the melody note where it's comfortable to play it, but not where it would have been written in the song, which would have been. But it's much more interesting to play it just like a singer singing with a little bit of rubato. Which is one of his most distinctive bits of cleverness, which we also find in his piano versions of the three Petrarch sonnets. So this is the first one, which people don't play so often, but they jolly well should. The second one is a piece that was quite close to him because he made several versions of it, and he wrote little album leaves for the Baroness Meyendorff using it. And it's very short and pithy song, but it's marvelous. The piano piece that's based on it is very, very straightforward. Always follow his instructions when he writes two arpeggio signs, one in the right hand and one in the left hand, like here. The rule of thumb should be to play those and these together so that the first note is together in both hands and the last note is together in both hands. This will serve you not just with Liszt but with all sorts of composers, and will make these sort of things sound just a little bit less messy than they sometimes do. Then, at the end of the next line, he writes arpeggio signs that cover the entire grand staff, so that then you arpeggiate from the bottom all the way to the top. And if you follow that carefully, it never lets you down. This is also very apparent in Petrarch's Sonnet 104, where the first time they're two separate arpeggios, and then as the theme builds up in tone, he allows the spread to go the whole way. There's a little passage here which is unfortunately designed to defeat amateurs because of the tenths, but he allows you to alter it if you wish. This is right at the end. There is no possibility that you can go, because that would be just revolting, and so he offers instead which doesn't do any violence to the music. It's like when you have to play. If you can't play those, I always think it would be better to play thirds, nice and sharply, rather than go as so many people do. That's a personal view. The third of the Liebesträume really requires no introduction from me. It's the single most often performed piece by Liszt. It doesn't actually take away from how amazingly beautiful it is. It's fairly rare for Liszt to write a long melody that breaks up into 4-bar phrases. He's usually getting his music ahead by picking a small motif and hanging onto it and worrying it like a dog with a bone. This one is a long spun tune. It's marvelous when it's a song. If you ever get the chance to accompany the song, please jump at it. And for the rest, you just do what it says on the tin. He says dolce cantando, and that's what you do. When you get to the end of this first section is another one of those things with notes with dots but a slur over the top of them. And as we know from the fingering that he left, not on this piece but on many others, he used to use the same finger for these notes. There are a couple of examples in the sonata where this works as well. And if you play all of these with your third or your third and second together with half pedal, then you will get the nice kind of drooping away sound that the voice can manage in a similar passage. When it says più animato con passione and then later says sempre stringendo, less is always more, because if you end up playing too fast, and then this sort of thing, which is a really ugly sound which you do not ever want to produce. So if you keep the tiger on a leash until you get to at the end of the cadenza that follows this, there's a famous wrong note in the sources. The manuscript is currently missing, so we can't confirm it or deny it. But under the last chord, just before the is this. The second note is a B flat. It's nearly always printed, which apart from being an extremely odd way of laying out the chord, which he never did anywhere else, we're able to confirm happily that in both versions of the song, it's, and in the earlier version of the piece for solo piano, which extraordinarily is in A major, it's. So I think we can rest assured that it should be a B flat. It's G in the first edition, but by the time Kistner reprinted it, which was well within Liszt's lifetime and it was reprinted many times, it had been changed to a B flat. So he might well have been the person who made the change. We don't have any evidence one way or the other. That's all one needs to say, except that the ritenuti at the end are of the kind that requires you to come back to tempo, because otherwise the last bars of this piece are often very, very tedious and very, very slow. So if you that's the first ritenuto. This is the second one. Then I suggest our tempo here. So keeping it simple without any further slowing down. That's all I'd like to say by way of a general introduction to the Consolations and the Liebesträume. Thank you.